This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 297 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I mentioned this on Twitter yesterday, but I really don't remember a fantasy football season where I had these dominant teams, just undefeated, steamrolling teams, weighed with these completely underwhelming ones. But then at the same time, when I look at the rosters of those two types of teams, the dominant ones and the ones that could use some help scoring, I don't even feel like the dominant ones are that much better. Like, sure, my Christian McCaffrey teams are rolling, and my Chris Godwin teams are looking pretty good too. And the one with both of them is absolutely crushing. But I've got teams with like Tyler Lockett, Mike Evans, and Alvin Kamara, and I'm not in a hurry to sell those guys. But those teams also just have 2 or 3 wins. So I guess I'm saying this because if you feel the same way, you're not alone. There are some annoying things happening this season. We just have to hope that math and logic ends up winning at the end of the year. And it almost always does. Before getting into this week's transactions, I just wanted to send another reminder about OddsFire. I use OddsFire each week when I'm doing my research because it's the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers and the regulated U.S. market. You can compare odds, quickly identify the best value, and even examine first-party FanDuel data all in one place. It's a great way to see line movement and where bets are being placed. Check it out now on oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Buy DeAndre Hopkins. So DeAndre Hopkins, a first-round draft pick, he hasn't lived up to expectation. But I don't think it's been all that bad, especially as bad as some people are making it out to be. He still ranks 25th in PPR points per game. He's seen at least 20% of Houston's targets in every contest this year, and he's playing with one of the best quarterbacks in football. His 28.1% target share is third highest among NFL wide receivers. Things should eventually even out. If a player is consistently seeing that type of volume, let alone a player of DeAndre Hopkins' caliber, they'll see results regardless of schedule. And I think there is some good news with Hopkins that he's improved over the last 2 weeks from a production standpoint. Week 5 against the Falcons, he was wide receiver 17. This past week, even though he was disappointing, he was a top 25 wideout. Because remember, from weeks 2 through 4, he saw Jalen Ramsey, Casey Hayward, and James Bradbury. If there's one piece of downside with Hopkins right now, it's been his red zone usage. Specifically, the number of targets that he's seen within the 10-yard line. He's only seen 1. He led the NFL last season with 15 of those targets. That's a little bit worrisome. But if we look at the larger sample size here, the larger sample size tells us that he's going to be targeted more than he's being targeted right now. In that area of the field, that is. If you don't think that that's going to happen, then he's more of a hold. If you don't think that his red zone usage is going to uptick, if you don't think he's going to score more touchdowns, he's a hold for you. But to me, I think he's a buy candidate for all of these obvious reasons. Sell Terry McLaurin. I took the L for Terry McLaurin earlier this season. I didn't love him as a prospect. I thought he was fine. I thought he was like a late second rounder, early third rounder in rookie drafts. But if we were to redraft right now, he would easily be a first round pick in rookie drafts. But I think that he's a sell candidate. He's coming off a big performance against Miami, which means you're selling him high to some degree. And he's also overperforming in the touchdown column to start the year. Over the last 5 seasons, wide receivers have scored a touchdown for every 164 yards receiving. As I talk about on this show each and every week, touchdowns correlate pretty strongly to yards. The more yards a player has, the more touchdowns he's generally going to score. McLaurin now has 5 touchdowns this year. That's about double the number that he should have based on his yardage total. And that's in a bad offense. So there's the touchdown regression, but then there's the upcoming schedule as well. Washington gets the 49ers defense in week 7, and then they get the Vikings and the Bills on the road. So not only is touchdown regression likely to hit Terry McLaurin, but this schedule doesn't set up well. So as awesome as a story that he is this year, I think he's a sell. Hold Jared Goff. Jared Goff's now thrown 3 or more touchdowns in a single game just once over his last 14 contests when you include the playoffs. And on the season, he now has 3 top 12 performances, which is fine, but then he has 3 where he finished QB 23 or worse. He's a headache. And you might be inclined to drop him in a 1-quarterback league right now. Because on Sunday, he threw for 78 yards. But don't do it. Not yet, at least. Because the Rams get the Falcons in week 7, who are allowing the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. And since Keanu Neal went down for Atlanta, They've given up 3 top 5 quarterback performances in 3 games while allowing 3.7 passing touchdowns per contest. And it doesn't hurt that the Rams get Cincinnati the week after. So you might get 2 good weeks out of Jared Goff. And after that, sure, you can probably drop him. But don't do it right now. Sell Damian Williams. I have no idea how the Chiefs are going to use their running backs entering every week. I have no clue. I don't want any part of this mess. Damian Williams saw 90% of Kansas City's running back carries 2 weeks ago and over 10% of the team's targets. In week 6, he ended up with an 11.1% running back rush share and a 2.9% target share. He was barely used. Considering he was able to find the end zone, though, you might be able to sell high in some way. As good as this backfield can be for fantasy purposes, it's really hard to buy into one of these running backs right now. Buy Josh Allen. So last week on this show, I talked about John Brown and buying John Brown as the Bills entered their bye week. Because the team's upcoming schedule coming out of this bye is amazing. Buffalo gets Miami, Philadelphia, Washington, and Cleveland, and then Miami once again. Each of those teams rank in the bottom half of the league in fantasy points allowed to the quarterback position, with 4 of those matchups coming against teams that rank in the bottom 10. I generally don't trade for a quarterback, and Josh Allen might just be on your waiver wire. But I generally don't trade for a quarterback, but if you can send a bench asset for Josh Allen right now, and if you really, really need a quarterback, it's not a bad idea. Buy Devin Singletary. So there's a theme on this week's show where I'm sort of getting guys who I can stash who might be league winners later in the season. I usually hate the term league winner, but it's an easy way to just capture how I feel about these guys. They're players with a lot of potential who could really break out later in the season. And I categorize Devin Singletary as that type of player. He was really close to playing in week 5, and I'm assuming since Buffalo had their bye last week, they just waited until this week. I do think he's going to be back this week. And that all creates an interesting buy low opportunity. I just mentioned that the Bills have a really easy schedule over the next month plus. And our 2-game sample with Devin Singletary this season is kind of intriguing. He had a 70% snap share in week 1, and then a 33% one in week 2. But in that week 2 game, he left in the middle of the 4th quarter with a hammy injury, and he's been sidelined since. His rushing usage was kind of weird in week 1. He saw all these snaps, but Frank Gore was the one who was getting the carries. But Singletary saw a 17% target share in that week 1 contest. And that high snap rate that he had is a good indicator of a stronger workload in the future. So basically what I'm saying is, you're buying Singletary right now because he's likely pretty cheap. That's first and foremost. He's also already had his bye. And we know the schedule is great, and there's not a whole lot in the way for him to see more work, to see a heavy workload. I think he's the right type of buy right now, and he could pay off as you inch towards the fantasy playoffs. Sell or hold the Cleveland Browns passing attack. Yeah, so this recommendation might seem a little late to some of you. And maybe you're thinking that things can't get much worse for Cleveland's passing attack. But I do think that it can. Now, I will say, one thing that does scare me about selling off the Browns' aerial attack is that Baker Mayfield has severely underperformed in the touchdown column this year. And it's not just because of bad play either. It's because he's been unlucky. Based on his near 1,500 passing yards, he should have well over 9 touchdowns this season. He currently has 5. That's the largest discrepancy that you will find in the NFL. Now, in most cases, I would buy a situation like that. But Cleveland's entering their bye week this week, and coming out of the bye, they get New England on the road, then the Broncos in Denver, then they get Buffalo, and then they'll wrap things up with a divisional game in Cleveland against a good Pittsburgh defense. If you have an average team or if you really need a win, you'll want to sell the Cleveland Browns before their bye. So this is the week to do it. Now, with that being said, I did say hold the Cleveland Browns passing attack as well, because they get Miami, Cincinnati, and Arizona down the stretch and into the fantasy playoffs. So they could realistically pay off later in the season. And I want that to be known for teams who can afford to take that on right now. Add Auden Tate. So Tate is rostered in just 23% of Yahoo leagues, and he looked great in week 6. He's seen at least 16% of Cincinnati's targets in each of the last 4 games, including a near 32% target share on Sunday against Baltimore. Yeah, AJ Green is going to be back eventually, but Auden Tate's not a bad add right now. Hold DJ Chark. Now, I'll be honest, DJ Chark is one of the bigger touchdown regression candidates in football right now. He's scored 5 times, but given his yardage total, that number should be closer to 3. But just because a player is bound to regress scoring-wise doesn't mean that that player should automatically be traded away. If the peripheral numbers look good, you want to keep that player. And that's the case with DJ Chark. Since week 1, he's fallen below a 25% target share in just one contest. He now accounts for over 22% of Jacksonville's targets this year. And the Jags have a decent schedule for the passing game over the next few weeks. They get the Bengals, the Jets, and the Texans. So he's not a player that I would target in a trade because there is some regression heading his way. But even with that regression, I wouldn't send him away either. Buy DJ Moore. So let's talk about another DJ, and that's DJ Moore. He just can't seem to find the end zone. He should have 2.6 touchdowns right now, according to his 425 receiving yards, but he scored only once this season. And Moore has been more involved in the Carolina passing attack of late. After seeing about 11% of the Panthers' targets during Kyle Allen's first 2 starts, and remember, I talked about this on my 10 Trends show a few weeks ago, but after seeing that type of target share, the last 2 games have seen Moore with a 26.7% share and a 32.3% one. So I think we can finally feel confident that whoever's under center, DJ Moore should be fine. And DJ Moore is a positive regression candidate. And he's on a buy right now, which means you might be able to get him for cheap. Add Jamal Williams. This transaction was going to be all about Mark Walton. I actually recorded something about Walton and for you guys to add him. So there's a bonus transaction for you. But then Jamal Williams happened last night. And he's in a much better situation than Mark Walton is. But on Monday night, after Aaron Jones fumbled and then dropped a touchdown, Jamal Williams saw the field more against the Lions. He had 3 more snaps than Aaron Jones, and he outrushed him 14-11. So not only could Jamal Williams just have some standalone value moving forward, but if something happens to Aaron Jones from an injury perspective, all of a sudden Jamal Williams is a fringe RB1. So he should definitely be added off the waiver wire this week. Sell Miles Sanders. I want Miles Sanders to be a thing. I really do. And as great as it was to see him do what he did through the air this past week, we've got to be realistic. The peripheral numbers were not that great for Miles Sanders. Against the Vikings, he played just 29% of the Eagles' offensive snaps. Jordan Howard was on the field for 63% of them. In a negative game script where you think it would favor Miles Sanders more than Jordan Howard, that was Sanders' lowest snap rate of the season. And as a result, he saw just 15% of Philly's rushes and a little over 7% of the team's targets. The production didn't really match the snap rate and the usage. That's why he's a perfect sell candidate this week. Add Darrell Henderson. Again, I'm looking for stashes right now. Things can change so quickly in fantasy football. And I think that Darrell Henderson makes sense as a really good stash. Todd Gurley missed week 6 with a thigh bruise. And there was a report on Sunday that said that there was a chance that he plays in week 7. A chance. We've been through this with Todd Gurley before. Darrell Henderson on Sunday, he played about 1/3 of LA's snaps. And I think that you could argue pretty easily that he was the better running back between he and Malcolm Brown. And Henderson was someone that my prospect model liked quite a bit. He was one of the most efficient running backs in college football history. I think he's the perfect flyer for your bench right now. And if Todd Gurley comes back and if Darrell Henderson gets put back on the bench, it's fine. It was a worthwhile speculative ad. Buy Jamison Crowder. So a couple weeks ago on this podcast, it was a 10 Trends episode, I mentioned a statistic that placed Jamison Crowder with pretty elite company. At the time, and this was heading into week 5, but at the time, only 6 wide receivers had seen a 20% target share or better in all 4 games played this year. Jamison Crowder didn't qualify because he already had a bye. But through 3 games, he had hit that mark in every single contest. Now, he had a down game in week 5, but in week 6, it wasn't a down game. Crowder saw 29% of the Jets' targets in a game that Sam Darnold returned. He now has almost a 27% target share for the Jets this season. That's the 6th highest mark at wide receiver. And he hasn't found the end zone yet. I know you guys are probably sick of me talking about this, but based on his receiving yardage total, Crowder should have 1.7 touchdowns this year. So this makes it a buy low moment for Crowder. Add the Kansas City Chiefs defense. It's really hard to find a defense that has low ownership in fantasy football right now. Defenses are being rostered all over the place. Now, with that being said, I don't mind the Chiefs who are going to Denver on Thursday night. The Broncos rank in the bottom half of the league in sack rate allowed. They're 11th worst in yards per play. They're 23rd in points scored. And Kansas City's a 3.5-point road favorite. There are other defenses that I like more, but I think Kansas City is fine. The 16th transaction that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column over on Number Fire this week is to add N'Keal Harry. It sounds like Harry's going to be practicing this week and he's on track to play when he's eligible in week 9. And for a team that's had some injuries at wide receiver, this is good news. He has a chance to walk into some volume, maybe not right away, but he could play into a heavier workload as we reach the fantasy playoffs. This is purely a speculative ad similar to someone like Darrell Henderson, but you'd rather be early with these guys than late. And as you guys know, Harry was the top wideout in my prospect model this year. He has a chance to be really good. So if you've got a deep enough bench, add him this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. If you're listening to the show on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.